Oral HSV-1, again, very common.
Hmm.
And let's say she works a moderate schedule, seeing 3 clients a day. That translates to 1,095 sexual acts per year. Statistically speaking, based on the 0.96% per act risk, if she does not use condoms for oral sex, how many men will she infect genitally in one single year?
The output of the simulation states that she will statistically infect 10.5 men per year.
Over 10 guys every single year will walk away with a permanent genital herpes infection, contracted entirely from a virus they thought was just a harmless cold sore.
Yeah.
And the model shows that even if she strictly insists on using a condom for oral sex, because of the skin-to-skin contact at the base of the penis that we discussed earlier, she will still statistically infect 3.7 men per year.
It is a profound, undeniable demonstration of how an infection viewed largely as a childhood nuisance, the common cold sore, has quietly become the dominant statistical vector for genital transmission in the sex work industry.
Now, before everyone panics, there is one major biological caveat that the sources mention regarding this specific oral HSV-1 risk, right? An immunological shield of sorts.
Yes. It comes down to pre-existing immunity. We mentioned that roughly 64% of the global population acquires HSV-1 in childhood. They get it from sharing drinks, from relatives kissing them on the cheek when they are toddlers. Because of this, a large portion of male clients already carry oral HSV-1 themselves.
So the crucial question is, if a man already has oral HSV-1, if he already gets cold sores himself, can he catch that exact same virus again on his genitals from receiving oral sex?
The biological risk is significantly, dramatically reduced.
Oh, that's good.
Once you contract a specific strain of the virus, your immune system builds a robust arsenal of IgG antibodies against that specific strain. Those antibodies circulate in your blood permanently.
Okay.
So if your genitals are exposed to HSV-1, your pre-existing antibodies will almost always fight it off and prevent the virus from establishing a new infection site in the sacral ganglion. It provides strong, though never 100% absolute protection.
So if the client is lucky enough to be among the 64% who already have it orally,
Yeah.
his risk of genital infection plummets. But if he is among the 36% who are completely naive to the virus, if he has never had a cold sore in his life, that 0.96% per act risk is basically a ticking clock.
A ticking clock is the perfect analogy. And that concept leads us directly to the next phase of our data analysis. With all these massive per-act numbers, these wild shedding rates, and these deep demographic prevalence statistics on the table, what does this actually look like for a regular client over an extended period of time?
We need to transition our brains from per-act risk to cumulative risk. This is where we finally answer the question, how long can you keep reaching into that jar and pulling out blue marbles before your hand inevitably closes around the red one?
To answer that, the sources define a specific simulation model. They call it the hobbyist model.
A hobbyist, okay.
This represents a client who sees an infected escort consistently, averaging 1.5 visits per week. Over the course of a year, that calculates to roughly 78 individual encounters.
Okay, I want to walk through the actual math here so we aren't just magically producing numbers. To calculate when this hobbyist client reaches a coin toss probability of getting infected, a straight 50-50 risk,
Yeah.
what formula is the Python script actually running?
The script utilizes standard cumulative probability formula. It is expressed as 1 minus the quantity of 1 minus the per tact risk r raised to the power of n, which is the total number of encounters.
Right.
In simple terms, it calculates the probability of not getting infected each time, multiplies that probability by itself for every single encounter, and then subtracts that final number from 100% to find the probability that infection has occurred.
All right, let's run the timelines using that formula. Let's start with scenario A. The client is seeing a woman who has confirmed genital HSV-2. Let's look at the unprotected timeline first.
At a frequency of 1.5 visits per week, engaging in unprotected vaginal sex with an HSV-2 positive partner, the formula dictates that the cumulative risk reaches a 50% probability threshold at approximately 407 encounters.
407 encounters. If we divide 407 by his annual rate of 78 visits, that translates to about 5.2 years.
Exactly.
So it takes 5 solid years of regular, weekly, unprotected intercourse with a positive partner to reach a mere 50-50 chance of catching the virus.
It is a surprisingly long runway. Now, let's look at the protected timeline for that exact same scenario.
Okay.
If he uses a condom perfectly every single time, altering the per-act risk from 1.7 to 0.595 per 1,000, the cumulative formula pushes that 50% risk threshold out to approximately 1,155 encounters.
11,155 encounters divided by 78 visits a year. That's roughly 14.8 years.
What is illuminating about this model is that it reveals the true mathematical role of the condom in a long-term chronic exposure scenario. A condom does not eliminate the risk.
Right, because of the exposed skin.
Exactly. Over an infinite timeline, cumulative risk always reaches 100%. What the condom does is dramatically alter the velocity of the timeline. It essentially buys the client time.
Buying time, I like that phrasing.
In this model, it nearly triples the safe window, extending the coin toss threshold from 5 years to almost 15 years.
And the sources note that pharmaceutical intervention can stretch this timeline out even further, right?
Absolutely. If the infected escort is taking a daily suppressive antiviral medication, such as valacyclovir, it fundamentally alters the biological shedding rate.
Oh, wow.
Clinical data shows daily antivirals cut asymptomatic shedding by roughly 50%. So if you combine daily antivirals with consistent, perfect condom use, you are lowering the per-act risk so significantly that you push that 50% cumulative risk threshold out by several decades.
That actually sounds somewhat reassuring. If precautions are taken, the math for genital HSV-2 allows for a very long window of interaction.
Yes.
But we have to run the same cumulative formula for scenario B. We have to look at the timeline for the oral HSV-1 curveball. The partner has the cold sore virus, and she performs unprotected oral sex on the client 1.5 times a week.
The mathematics of this scenario are far, far less forgiving.
I'm looking at the output chart for the time frame for unprotected oral sex. To reach that exact same 50% probability of infection, the model says it only takes 11 months. 0.92 years.
In less than one single year of weekly visits, the sheer volume of oral shedding compounds so rapidly that it becomes statistically more likely than not that the naive client will contract a genital HSV-1 infection.
11 months.
Yeah.
That is terrifyingly short. We just went from a 14.8-year runway with protected intercourse down to an 11-month runway for unprotected oral.
Yeah.
And what if he realizes this danger and insists on using a condom for oral sex?
Protected oral sex does extend the timeline, but only marginally. The 50% threshold is pushed out to about 2.6 years.
The contrast between these two scenarios is just staggering. The activity that intuitively feels the riskiest, the most intimate, unprotected intercourse with someone who has a confirmed case of genital herpes actually gives you a mathematically verified 5-year runway before you hit a 50-50 risk.
It does.
But the activity that feels like a casual, safe compromise, getting oral from someone who gets cold sores, gives you less than a year.
It is the ultimate proof that human intuition is a deeply flawed mechanism for assessing viral transmission risk. We assess danger based on visual severity, historical reputation, and cultural stigma.
Right.
We fear the genital blisters, so we avoid them. We normalize the cold sore, so we ignore it. But the mathematical models don't care about cultural stigma. The math assesses risk purely on the biological realities of shedding frequency and anatomical barriers.
Okay, if you are a client or an escort or just someone navigating the dating pool and you are listening to this, your head is probably spinning right now.
I wouldn't blame them.
We've talked about 1,000-sided dice, massive 82.8% prevalence rates in specific zip codes, and 11-month ticking clocks. The obvious immediate reaction is, I need to get tested right now, I need to know for sure where I stand, and I need to demand that my partners show me their test results.
Which brings us to the final and undoubtedly the most frustrating piece of our source data. We have to confront the clinical reality of diagnostic testing.
We mentioned very early on that physical exams are basically useless because of asymptomatic shedding. A doctor looking at your skin under a bright light and saying, looks fine to me, means mathematically nothing. The virus could be swarming on a microscopic level.
Right.
So you have to get a blood test, specifically a serological survey looking for IgG antibodies.
Yes, let's explain the biology of that test. When your body is exposed to the herpes virus, your immune system eventually realizes there is a foreign invader. In response, it begins manufacturing specific immunoglobulins known as IgG antibodies to fight it.
Okay.
The standard blood test does not look for the virus itself because the virus hides deep in the nerve ganglion. Instead, the blood test looks for the presence of these IgG antibodies circulating in the bloodstream. If you have the antibodies, it means you have the virus.
But the body doesn't produce those antibodies the morning after you are exposed. It takes time to build that immune response.
Exactly. There is a mandatory incubation and window period. The absolute earliest these antibodies might begin to reach detectable levels in the blood is around 3 weeks after the initial exposure.
But 3 weeks isn't enough to be sure. If you test at 3 weeks and get a negative result, You can't trust it.
No, you can't.
The clinical standard for accuracy, the timeline required to actually trust a negative test result, requires waiting much, much longer. The sources state that standard medical guidelines recommend waiting 12 to 16 weeks. That is 3 to 4 full months.
And this introduces the most critical disruptive factor in sexual health diagnostics, the abstinence rule.
The abstinence rule.
To guarantee that a negative blood test is a true negative and not just a false reading because the antibodies haven't formed yet, the individual must abstain from all sexual contact, including oral sex, for a full 3 months prior to the blood draw.
Okay, let's use an analogy to really highlight how absurd this diagnostic reality is. Imagine you are terrified of your house burning down. So you install a highly advanced smoke detector, but the manufacturer tells you this specific smoke detector is programmed to only sound the alarm 3 months after a fire starts.
Right.
And to make sure the smoke detector is actually capable of working, you have to evacuate the house, live in a tent on the lawn, and promise not to light a single match or turn on the stove for an entire 3 months while you wait to see if it beeps.
It is an incredibly cumbersome, highly impractical diagnostic tool for anyone who is actively engaging in a sexual lifestyle.
It's worse than impractical. In the context of our scenario, it's an economic impossibility. In a high-turnover environment like the escorting industry, taking a 3-month vow of strict celibacy just to validate a single blood test means 3 months of zero income.
That's very true.
It is never, ever going to happen, which means a very harsh reality for the client. Any test result an escort shows you on her phone isn't a guarantee of her present status. It is merely a historical snapshot. It only tells you what her viral status was 3 to 4 months before the needle actually went into her arm.
It proves that testing in this environment is inherently retrospective, not prospective. And unfortunately, that is assuming the test itself is perfectly accurate.
Right.
Which, according to the data from urban populations, it often isn't. We need to look at the specific data regarding test sensitivity.
Let's get into the weeds on the tests themselves. The standard test used by most clinics, and the one utilized in the Johns Hopkins Serosurvey, is called the Focus Herpes Select ELISA.
ELISA stands for Enzyme-Linked Immunosorbent Assay. In a general, low-risk, broad population setting, the ELISA test has a very high sensitivity, typically cited around 96% to 100%.
So normally it's pretty good.
Meaning if you have the antibodies, the test is very good at catching them. However, the study data points to a major alarming caveat for the specific demographic we are focused on today. In certain urban populations, specifically looking at data from men attending Baltimore STD clinics, the sensitivity of the standard ELISA test was found to be lower, considerably lower.
How much lower are we talking?
In that specific urban demographic, the sensitivity of the ELISA dropped to 82.6%.
Let me do the math on that. 82.6% sensitivity means that the test has a failure rate of 17.4%.
Yes.
It means the test is throwing false negatives. It is completely missing about 17% of true active infections in that specific urban demographic.
Nearly 1 in 5 people in that clinic who actually carry the virus, who are capable of shedding it and transmitting it, will be handed a piece of paper by a doctor telling them they are negative.
Going back to the smoke detector analogy, you waited 3 months outside your house, you didn't light a single match, the detector finally gives you the green light. But there is a 17% chance your kitchen is actually on fire, and the detector just didn't notice.
It's a huge flaw.
Why is it failing so badly in these specific clinics?
It often comes down to cross-reactivity with other biological factors, or the way the test calculates its index values. The ELISA measures the density of antibodies. If the density falls below a certain numerical threshold, it calls it negative. But in highly saturated urban environments where people might be exposed to multiple overlapping infections or have different immunological baselines, those index values can become muddy and inaccurate. This is precisely why the source material mentions the necessary gold standard test.
The Western blot.
Yes, the University of Washington Western blot is fundamentally different from the ELISA. It doesn't just look for bulk antibodies, it actually separates the viral proteins and looks for antibodies binding to highly specific, distinct bands of the virus. It is incredibly accurate.
But here is the massive catch with the Western blot. It is expensive, it is notoriously hard to access.